Welcome to the Swine Time Podcast. I am your host, Spencer Wayne. I'm one of the staff veterinarians here at Pipestone Veterinary Services. I get to work with farmers regularly throughout the week, but then they let me do this one fun thing. I do more than one fun thing, but this one fun thing I really like, which is host this podcast, the Swine Time Podcast, and we have guests from within our company and outside our company talking about things that would be of interest to our audience, which is mostly farmers. A lot of them are shareholders. Some people not affiliated at all, but people that are interested in pigs and topics related to pigs. And today, I have two guests, and I always say special guests, but you're always special guests, Emily Radcliffe and Kim Morgan, who are going to talk about what to do with leftover feed. So on your farm, you'll have leftover feed. What do you do with it before you start the next group of pigs? It's in the bin. Can you keep it? Can you use it? That's the topic. And I will shut up and introduce, or allow my guests to introduce themselves. Emily, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll turn it over to Kim.
Yeah, I've been with Pipestone for 8 years now, almost 8 years. I am originally from Comfrey, Minnesota, which is about an hour and a half east of Pipestone. I live in central Wisconsin now today, so I work more in our eastern territory with producers. I'm a nutritionist. I got my degree at South Dakota State, and then I started with Pipestone right out of college. So I've learned a lot through being with Pipestone for those 8 years. And today I kind of just get to work with, our producers one-on-one, kind of helping them figure out challenges on their farm with their program and helping them get the best performance they can from their pigs.
Okay. Really cool. Do you specialize in growing pig nutrition or sow nutrition, or is there any specialty that you focused on?
Yeah, I'd be more on the wean to finish side than the sows today.
Okay. Great.
Yep.
Kim.
Yes, I'm Kim Morgan. I come from a small town in north central Iowa called Sway City, and I've been working for Pipestone for about 18 and a half years now, working in the grow finish realm of the company and helping farmers, succeed in what they do every day.
Yeah, and I'm not going to let Kim just stop there in her introduction. Kim is a ninja with pigs. She's very, very good. And so when people in the past, I remember when I first started working with you, your ability to focus on what does the pig need in the barn at that time for the environment or the feed or everything else, just super, super level of abilities.
Thank you, Spencer. I appreciate that. My joy is working with the farmers and also with our fellow employees that we have that I help to oversee. And the swine industry has changed a lot over the last 18 years. Mm-hmm. And, being adaptable and learning new things is always challenging, but always rewarding at the same time.
Yeah. Now we'll get into the topic, which is what do you do with feed that's left over after the pigs are gone? And it doesn't seem like it'd be a big topic, but we could spend an hour talking about this because it's just got a gazillion angles it could go into. So we should just get into one of the areas and kind of peel it apart. But maybe start with just describing what happens for anybody listening out there in a wean to finish or a nursery or a finishing barn when you progress through the diets, what happens at the end. So just describe the situation. Either one of you can take that.
Okay. Well, a lot of times, the pigs at the end maybe won't eat as much as we think they should, and so obviously we have leftover feed. So at that point, we have to decide what group's coming in next. Is it going to be a wean pig group? Is it going to be a feeder to finish group? And that would maybe alter what you're going to do with the feed when the group is done. And so if you have a feeder to finish group, a lot of times if it's not a large amount of feed, we can blend it in with a ration 4 or 5. We would have to look at if you have tandem bins mm-hmm. versus single bins, and those things would, come into play also. So with tandem bins, obviously we can shut the bin and put the new feed in the other bin, and then when the pigs are a little older, we can blend it. So I think, Emily, from a nutrition standpoint, maybe you could add to that.
Yeah. With the, oftentimes it's a phase 10 that's left over in the bin at a wean to finish site most commonly that we see mm-hmm. leftover feed and how we should deal with it. And to Kim's point, it's easiest to manage that feed when the bins are tandem because oftentimes you can just blend that in once they get through the nursery and they're on to their first finisher diet and do just like a 50-50 blend, opening those two bins up at the same time to kind of get rid of that phase 10 or that last finisher diet.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of like you just described it, the situation where I'm going to assume some things. You get a diet being fed to close to a 300-pound pig, and now you're saying, can I feed that to, in the most extreme case, a 12-pound pig coming in? And so what would be I'm thinking of the negatives in my mind, but are the negatives of feeding a diet, a phase 10 diet that's going to a 300-pound pig to a 12-pound pig coming in? What can happen wrong?
A lot of things, yeah. So not just from a performance standpoint, but also from, health or mortality. Sometimes you can see some E. coli breaks or different things like that happen if you're feeding that phase 10 to a nursery pig that's just coming off of milk from its mother and going straight onto a corn soy diet, right? It's not able to utilize any of that nutrients within the diet that's corn or soybean meal, that protein or energy, because it's used to using milk as its energy source. So it's basically just going to sit there and not have any energy to utilize within that phase 10 diet. So besides, performance, you're going to potentially see some fallouts, mortality from also feeding that phase 10 to a newly weaned pig.
Mm-hmm. Kim, how bad can it get? You've probably seen a few cases where they brought the wrong feed or that they fed the wrong diet.
Right.
How bad can it get for bad E. coli?
For a bad E. coli, it can be extremely hard on the pigs, and it can also be extremely hard on the people in the barns having to take care of these pigs. We've had times where we've had to roll the feeder all the way shut and just feed rolled oats to the pigs. The mortality on it can be devastating. I've seen it where it's been as high as 10% in just a couple weeks' time in the nursery. So we depend on our nutrition department to make up our rations or our recipes for our feed for each stage of their growing, and we rely on that. So then if we take that and take the 300-pound ration, 10, and we try to feed that to a 12-pound pig, it just sets us up for a lot of challenges.
Right. And so, Emily, you brought up something with the tandem bins. If you have tandem bins, and I'm guessing most wean to finish barns would be set up with tandem bins, but not all. And nurseries, probably less so, but that'd be less of an extreme jump from an end nursery to a new nursery.
Yep.
But you would just say, hold that there, hold it in the bin, and let's get through 3 or 4 weeks of feeding through the other bin.
Yep.
Just going phase after phase until you get to close to the end of the nursery phase is
Yep.
where you would start to blend that in.
Yeah. And K-State actually completed a trial evaluating this because, oftentimes it's just you assume you want to wait until that pig is out of that nursery period before you would introduce that diet into their feed. But K-State actually completed a trial looking at can you feed it to, a 1 week, 2 week, 3 week old pig. And what they saw is that 2 week old pig, that 7 to 14 day period, that phase 2 usually that you would feed that phase 2 nursery diet is where they saw the biggest negative impact. That pig just did not rebound from feeding that 50-50 blend of a finisher diet. Yep. When you look at it
was worse than a newborn or not a newborn, a newly weaned pig getting it.
Well, they didn't do the phase
the ration one.
Oh, okay.
The phase 1. Yep. They did not introduce any of that leftover phase 10 because of the impact that we would expect there.
Okay.
So they just started on either the phase 2, phase 3, or that phase 4. And in the phase 2, those pigs just didn't rebound, come back from it. So when you looked at your overall period, I think it was a 45-day study, they saw that your average daily gain was significantly impacted by feeding that 50-50 blend of your phase 2 and your finisher 10 or your last finisher diet in that phase 2 period.
So literally, it permanently scarred them on growth. They had no compensatory gain to catch them back up.
No.
They just stayed behind.
Yep. They did see that really in that 14 to 21 days and the 21 to 28 days, those two periods were pretty similar for performance. So you could potentially introduce it into that, 3 week old or phase 3. But usually we like to say just wait until they've transitioned on to that first finisher diet so you're not creating any more stressors to that pig.
Okay. So that was phase 10 back to really young pigs. If somebody's got a nursery, not a wean to finish barn, and you finish out on a 8 week old or 8 week on feed diet or 7 week on feed diet, that size pig, a 50-pound pig, that's a lot easier to work into an earlier diet. Or is it the same? Would you have the same considerations there? Like, no, we gotta we can't feed that until the third or fourth weekend, or when would you comfortably pull a end phase nursery diet back to an early nursery diet?
Depending on, the nursery, a lot of times you don't have tandem bins at the nursery. And oftentimes you don't have a lot of leftover phase 4 as well. You're able to kind of allow some wiggle room of when you want to move those pigs out of the nursery.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have to blend a little bit of that phase 4 into that phase 1, it's not as bad, right? And if we think about it, the way that feed is going to blend into the feeder, if you do have to put a phase 1 on top of a phase 4, is it's going to pull that phase 1 down first, right? So
It'll pull it through the middle.
It'll pull it through the
bin.
middle.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So you just described tandem bin setups, and with the farmer having the ability to work back in that older pig diet into younger one at however they wanted to do it, either right away at third weekend or something, but they had that as a tool. A lot of nurseries won't have a tandem. Older barns a lot of times won't have a tandem bin set up. So, Kim, we were talking earlier, and you said, you got to get the mill will come pick it up. And so just touching on that for a second, if you can't comfortably rework it, it's in the bin itself, and you have to have it picked up, how does that work? The mill's got vacuum equipment or an auger with a boot to slide under the bin's boot? Or
I have seen both systems where they will vacuum it out or they will auger it out. You'd want to make sure that you know what your health status is on the farm that you're taking it out of, or the bin you're taking it out of, and then where you're going with it, what is the health status there also. Because it may not be, the same
And so
level of health.
Within a system that has their own mill, they can make that decision for themselves.
Correct.
They can pick up feed out of a bin and refeed it at another site. Commercial mills would stay like a 10-foot pole length away from that. So what if you're a farmer that doesn't have your own feed mill or feed trucks? What are the options there to get it out if you thought you had to get it out of there?
If you do have to get it out of there, sometimes feed mills will, charge accordingly, but take that feed out of the bin, come and back it out. But if not, unfortunately, oftentimes you might have to run that feed into the pit, depending on how much feed is actually there.
Right.
You might have to run some of that feed into the pit if the feed mill, is unwilling to come vac out that feed for you. But it is expensive when a feed mill comes to vac out leftover feed. So you always want to the best of your ability, manage that feed that's at the site.
Well, I imagine, it becomes fertilizer essentially once it goes in the pit, and it'll digest a little bit down there and go through some biologic process.
Yep.
So you probably do want to weigh that. Maybe it's just easier to run it in the pit and then have slightly more nutrient-dense manure in the fall versus having the mill come suck it out just to throw it away.
Yeah, as long as it's not too much, right? Because sometimes that can cause some issues in your pit if you just got a big pile of feed in there. So, as long as it's not too much feed, sometimes that's the best option. The easiest option is to run a little bit of feed in the pit.
Okay. So another option I can think of is you just open the boot and just literally throw it in the loader bucket, and just get rid of it there. We got tandem bins, let you rework it, incorporate it back in as an older pig, and then might have to just take it out. Then the next question comes up, well, when do you know when you've just got to take it out versus can I just feed it straight? And I don't know if there's an answer for this, but let's say you had some phase 10 in there and you got new wean pigs coming in. Is it even an option to blend if it's a ton on a 20-ton bin or something like huge bin? What percent could be finishing feed before you get a problem? If you can't, let's say you can't easily get it taken out and you'd have to spend a lot of time and it was just 1 ton, what safe amount is there to put into a pig's first diet? Is there a safe amount?
I would say there's not a safe amount.
So don't even try it.
Don't risk it.
No, it's not worth the risk of your incoming group of pigs. As we talked about a little earlier here with the E. coli, challenges that you could face with that.
Right. What about for a feeder pig?
For a feeder pig, if you've got a 60-pound pig coming in the door and you need to blend it into that phase, really it'd be like a phase 4 or 5, like a 60 to 90-pound diet. There's no issues with blending it into that one or, putting that feed on top of that phase 10.
Got to be. It's just you'd have a less efficient feed or something for the portion of it.
Yeah, for a little bit. Yep.
Okay.
And most times when you're transferring nursery pigs, you're probably into ration 4, maybe 5.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And if you had an estimate of, I was just thinking about this too, if you knew the feed that was in there, is there any nutritionist level work that you could say, hey, I've got 2 tons on a 10-ton bin, so 20% of my diet is going to be this diet, where you put a different diet in the other remaining 8 tons just to blend it better? On average, you don't. That's way splitting hairs.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's splitting hairs because you really don't know how that bin is going to feed into the barn, into the feeder. So, you might get, if you're trying to adjust that, one feeder might get X amount of that phase, that last phase, right, that 300-pound phase versus another feeder. So it's really hard in that scenario. So most times we don't make any adjustments for it.
Okay. What could go wrong with old feed in general? Like, does feed get old? You mentioned something earlier about the vitamins or things not holding together, or the fat quality not holding together. Can you comment a little on that? If you've got old feed, just besides not being the right feed, it might have other problems.
Yeah, the biggest thing I think we get concerned with feed sitting in a bin for 5 to 6 weeks or more is probably from the fat oxidation or like the lipid oxidation that we see. So if you have corn oil, choice white grease, or soy oil in your phase, your last finisher diet, that's what we would get most concerned with, is just maybe some of that oxidation that's occurring within the diet. As far as, vitamins go, minerals go, there's not enough that's going to be, those soluble vitamins probably aren't going to break down to impact that pig that much, as long as you're blending in another diet with it. But with the lipid oxidation, we get concerned with sometimes is just some serum vitamin E levels and different things like that, or poor performance that we could impact that pig.
Okay. You say serum vitamin E levels would result from having bad quality fat or rancid fat or oxidized fat?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Is there any way to know, just practically looking at the feed, like this is too old? Could you make a judgment call by looking at the feed or smelling the feed?
Not really probably looking at it. I mean, your fat content in that feed is so low when you look at the grand scheme of things. It's probably 2% or less. So it's hard to probably smell it and be able to pick up a bad smell if it's only been in the bin for, 5 weeks. If it's wet, oftentimes, yes, you'll be able to tell if it's bad feed. But it's really hard to tell just by smelling or looking at a complete feed that's been sitting there for a few weeks.
Okay. I'm just kind of guessing. Everything you said, I'm sure, is correct. But for the guy out in the barn, he's thinking, I've got 2 tons left in this bin. It's summer. It's been there a while. What are the guidelines for when I got to dump it versus work it back in versus just feed it straight? I mean, so one of the things I know that the listeners are going to think is like, well, what are my rules of thumb? Are there any rules of thumb for, I've got feed that's this many months old in the summer, I shouldn't even think about keeping it? Or you just keep it and you got a risk of some problems happening is probably what people are going to do.
I would say if you think of like months old, then probably don't consider feeding it back in. If we're like that 1 month, time frame is usually pretty typical that you can get it like fed back to that new group that's within the barn. I don't have too much concern there. But it really, the components of it are heat, and moisture that can make that feed go bad. And so summertime, humid, that's like the worst case scenario, right? So if it's winter and you've got feed sitting for a little bit longer, you're probably a little bit safer. But if you get to summertime and it's hot, humid out, I would say get that feed used up as quick as possible in the best way to blend that back in.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's some rule of thumb on like how bad is too bad, I don't even want to feed it. It'd be better to haul it out and spread it in the field. Okay, Kim, just on that same topic, what does it look like when you're dealing with old bad feed from at the barn level? Like, this is bad. What do you see that you'd say this is too old, I've got to get rid of it?
The flow isn't what we want it to be. It doesn't flow very well. It will clump up. You'll get big chunks of feed. You'll sometimes see that when we don't have the feed flowing through and all of a sudden somebody says, I've got feed hung up in my bin. Then we want to make sure that we're checking that out too.
You ever get it where it smells bad?
I was just going to say, yes. Sometimes you can smell it, especially if it's in the summertime where you have more heat. Those bins will heat up very quickly. And so I think that, just being aware of what's in the bin when you get to the end of the turn is just as important as how much is left in the bin.
Yeah. That
you're kind of just do a mental check on it and check the quality of it as it's, before you empty the bin out.
So in a situation where maybe you're the person that owns the pigs and you've got a contract grower, and you think the contract grower is probably pretty responsible and decent, but I'm thinking worst case scenario or common bad case scenarios that happen a lot is you don't know what's in the bin. You're not on the farm because it's a contract grower, and maybe that person says, "Oh, it's mostly empty or not." What are some practical steps just to maintain a good eye on your pig assets that are out there in contract settings? If somebody's listening and say, "I got these 2 rented barns," is there a set of questions that you should always go through to make sure that your feed is really well understood? I'm supposing it's just like what feed's in the bin, but how much do you have to really drill down on those? I don't know if people commonly do that or they just trust that it's empty.
I think the trust goes a long ways with people that have been working together for a long time. One of the things, if it's a new contract grower, is ask the questions. Did you climb up the bin and take a look to see actually how much feed is in there? Or did you just kind of go around and rap on it with a rubber mallet? And then, just taking a look inside the bin, is there anything hanging up on the sides, or, is it look fairly clean?
How many people are using either bin cameras or scale bins to get a good estimate on how much feed's in there?
The growers that I work with, there's quite a few bin scales out there right now. As far as the cameras, I have not seen them in action yet.
Okay. Emily, you got any thought on that? That's another tool for just managing your feed inventory.
Yeah, there's a lot of larger systems out there that are kind of going with, it's not necessarily a camera, but it's sensors within the bin that kind of tells you.
Sorry. Yeah. That's what I mean is what you're talking about.
I think there's
like
also
a radar
cameras too, but like sensors within the bin that tell you how much feed is in there, as well as scales. The larger systems, for sure, I think it pays for itself because, when you're just trusting, 15 plus growers, depending on your size, right, to just place a feed order and manage the bins accurately, that can cost you quite a bit, right? If they're overfeeding one budget versus the other, or not, managing their bins correctly. But, for the smaller guys, it kind of depends, right? I mean, it's an expensive investment, so you just want to make sure that it's going to show that return. If you've got someone that you trust, like Kim said, 100%, then it's probably okay just to, they're good at what they're doing. You don't need to put a scale or those bin sensors in there, but it all depends on your system, I think.
Okay. Since you brought up money, and we could go beyond just talking about a little bit of leftover older pig feed, but just feeding the wrong diets and not having good management of your diets with the pigs that are in there. If you were saying doing it really well versus not doing it well, how much money per pig is on the table of managing your bin inventory, feeding the diet out, not having a bunch of leftover feed at the end to feed to the new pigs? What does that boil down to? Is it pennies a pig or dollars a pig, or what kind of a number are we talking about if you were guessing?
That's a good question. I think, the biggest impact that you're going to have is probably on your average daily gain if you're going to feed that 300-pound diet to a younger pig. So you could potentially impact that performance on that next pig coming in the door. And so, if you're giving up, a pound or 2 at marketing, right, we're not going to significantly impact their average daily gain for a lifetime period, but it really comes down to, okay, are you going to have higher mortality if that feed has gone bad? Are you losing 1% mortality if you do have something that feed causes a mortality issue? That's already $1 a pig, right, that you're going to cause from just 1% mortality impact, versus, if you're only seeing a pound or 2 lighter pig at market, that impacts a little bit less. But
okay.
And that goes back to the point we said, if you do have a hemolytic E. coli break, that how devastating that can be mortality-wise, and then, the effect it has on their gut in their gain.
Yeah. Okay. What have we not covered on this topic of what to do with leftover feed?
I think the only other thing that you want to be cautious of is if you're feeding schisis in, your finisher diets and you've got leftover feed at a site, you just want to be, and oftentimes you won't even have, Denigard on site or Denigard in your feed if you do have schisis in your feed, but you just want to make sure that, there's a few producers that make sure that the phase the last delivery of phase 10 does not have schisis, just in case if they have leftover feed. So that's probably the last nugget you just want to be cautious of is if there is schisis in that last finisher diet.
Especially if you don't have tandem bins on your site.
Yep.
Yeah.
That can have a big impact on it.
And for the listeners, schisis is I think it's an ionophore, would be the class that it is, but it has a potential harmful reaction when you include another one of the antibiotics with it if they're fed together. And you can do that accidentally is what happens. So if you have it in the feed and then you use Tiamulin with it unknowingly, you will cause some pig mortality and health issues. Mm-hmm. Okay, so good point. Watch what you feed in the last diet in case you do have to rework it into the new diet. Anything else? What to do with leftover feed?
I think that covers it all.
I think it does.
Okay. Oh, you did mention something earlier when we were talking. You can avoid it if you have the ability to manipulate your transportation events. So that was a good point you brought up before we did the podcast.
Right. So if you are transferring pigs from your nursery stage into a finisher, say you think, oh, if I had one more day, if your flow can allow it, that would be in your best interest. That would be one way of getting rid of the feed in a good way, and then letting it be utilized through the pig.
Yeah, literally guessing I got 2.5 days worth of feed. Let's move these pigs on this day to actually empty the bin out pretty darn close to being right on the numbers.
Right. And, in some flows that's not possible because you know how long it takes you to clean up your barn and you know when your wean pigs are coming back.
Yeah. If you're a farmer and you have this happen where you've got a significant amount of feed or any amount of feed from the last phase of production and you're wondering, can I feed this to the newer pigs as they come in? What are their options for finding help on that for advice? I suppose they could call any number of people, but who would they call to ask for questions on that?
Yeah, I would say you can call, if you have someone that you're working like a production team with, a lot of times they'll be able to help you manage through that. Or if you have a good relationship with your nutritionist and you're just curious, hey, what diet should I start blending that into? But a lot of times, the production team that you have helping you, they should be oftentimes able to answer that.
Yeah, I'd say like for Kim, if you had a Kim Morgan or if you knew a Kim Morgan, you would call her and say, hey, I got about 2 tons left. Do you think that'll be a problem? She's seen a lot of stuff, so you would have good advice for what you can get away
and
with.
if I was in question, I would reach out to somebody like Emily and say, what are your thoughts on this? But
worst case scenario, what would happen if I did this? Yeah.
Right.
So just reach out. It's a phone call. It's a phone call, and you might avoid a big problem. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, good. I think we've covered that topic fairly well. Listeners should have listened to it and gotten something out of it or for just some practical advice, I hope. Yep. And I'll thank you guys for being on the show. And I'll thank our listeners for tuning into this episode of the Swine Time Podcast and invite them to the next one. The Swine Time Podcast was created for the pork industry and individual pork producers around the country. Hosted by me, Dr. Spencer Wayne with Pipestone Veterinary Services, the podcast contains pork industry news, advancements in animal care, and how to enhance your productivity. Find the Swine Time Podcast at www.pipestone.com or on your favorite listening platform.